Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As you know, David Makovsky was not able to join us for our Florida Symposium last week, and I personally want to extend my appreciation to him for doing this makeup session, or in this case, a bonus session, because any time with David is really a bonus. Lynn Levy-Pasekis is now going to formally introduce David.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeannie. It is my great pleasure to introduce David Makovsky, the Institute's Ziegler Distinguished Fellow. I am sure that David is well known to all our guests today. David joined the Institute after a career as an award-winning journalist with the Jerusalem Post, Haaretz, and the U.S. News and World Report. In 2013 and 14, he worked in the office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. He is director of our Haaretz project on Arab-Israel relations in the Irwin Levy Family Program on the U.S.-Israel strategic relationship. We are fortunate to have David with us here today after he has concluded his most recent round of meetings with top officials in Israel. David, the floor is yours, and thank you.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you. It's good to have you on, and Jay Bernstein, our president, and on Jeannie, of course, who's the magician of all Floridian events. And I'm only sorry I couldn't join because of my trip, and I also got COVID. It just it was an incredible visit, but I was planning to come and be with you, so I hope I can make it up, and I to be with you in person in the future. So thank you, and thank you for your understanding. Look, we're in the middle of this Ukraine crisis. I know everyone is glued to the TV. I never think in our lifetime we would see refugee flows like we're watching now, a war in Europe. It is just so heartbreaking. I know everybody is just riveted by developments there. And you don't need me to kind of summarize that conflict. I feel that I always want to know, what's the value added? What's the value added? And I think the value added in terms of this conflict, in terms of a couple of other developments, are what is the Israel angle? What is the Mideast angle? We have a lot of people, thank God, at the Institute that could talk about different angles of the Middle East. So I'll stick more on the Israel part. And that was also my trip to Israel and to Ramallah. I think we had something like, in some of these meetings Dennis and I did together with cabinet ministers and generals, I think we had over 50 meetings, 50. It was a lot. Some I had to do on Zoom because of COVID. I want to thank my assistant, Jonah Schrock, who was with me. And so it was like a hybrid, some in person, some on Zoom. For those of you who might go on the trustee trip in June, we've already put in our asks in our meetings, Dennis and I, for them to meet the Washington Institute trustees. So I think it will be really exciting. No one has said no to us so far. We got a lot of yeses. And so we're very much looking forward to that trip. Look, sometimes developments aren't always what they appear to be. Here's today is an amazing moment in some ways for Israel, but in some ways there's a lot of skepticism. So I'll get back to the Ukraine in a moment, but I just want to give this as an example of what you see is not always what is the motivation behind things. And people who are Washington Institute trustees know this. There's more behind the story than it appears. For example, President Herzog is paying a visit to Ankara today. It's a big deal given all the clashes with President Erdogan of Turkey, who has often been viewed as a champion of the Muslim Brotherhood, who said some very tough things about Israel. And yet he's welcoming the president of Israel after all these many years suddenly to Ankara. Now, why is that happening? It's happening, I think, because the Turks are very much feel that they're in bad position in Washington. Ever since they went and got the S-400 air defense system from the Russians, it cost them with the F-35s in NATO and the United States. They want to repair their American relations. They'd like to at least get F-16s if they can't get the F-35s. which they lost because they went off and got a Russian system. So this is an example of that the road to kind of Washington runs through Jerusalem for the Turks. They seem to ascribe a lot of power to Israel and to Jews in America. And I think with Erdogan, it's clear that if he didn't feel he had to do it, he wouldn't do it. Why is Israel doing it? Well, always Israel is looking for outreach to Muslim states. They clearly, it's not a secret, and I felt that on my trip. They felt that if they could get, visit Turkey, that Turkey would kick out Hamas from Istanbul. They're running a lot of these West Bank attacks out of Turkey. Salah Haruri, it's no secret Israel wants Salah Haruri out of Turkey. Would he go to Lebanon? Would he go to Qatar? I don't know, but I think it sticks in Israel's throat that there's been attacks on Israelis in the West Bank, and it's being done out of Turkey. So there's some understandings here. I don't think it's complete yet. I do think that the Turks have kind of slipped it out through the press in the run up to the Herzog visit, that they have stopped like 8 assassination attempts on Israelis in Turkey that they felt were targets of the Iranians and the like. So what looks like, a lot of flags and handshakes today in Ankara, you got to like kind of dig below the headlines. The Turks are looking at Herzog with an eye towards Washington, and the Israelis are looking at the Turks hoping to kick out Salah Haruri and Hamas from their command operations out of Turkey. So these things will be evaluated over time. Was it worth it for each side? But it's an example of what isn't always what it appears to be. Now, on the Ukraine issue, I think there it's a bit complex too, in that you read in the press about Bennett's trip to Moscow, and people say, why did Bennett go? He's the only Western leader to go to see Putin. And here we got a map, I think, for you on that about Israel's situation in Syria. And again, it fits the theme of this talk, which is what is not always what it appears to be. You could say, what is Bennett going to Moscow for have to do this with Syria? But the fact is that, and he went on Shabbat, by the way. He's an Orthodox Jew who went on Shabbat. I think he is very aware. I know he's very aware. His people tell me that Israel needs the skies of Syria to be open. And the skies of Syria being open, Israel's had over 2,000 strikes against Iranian rocket targets and the like. They didn't like Hezbollah. It's like they didn't like the book. They don't want to see the movie. They didn't stop the entrenchment of Hezbollah in real time, and there's 140,000 rockets there. And now the fear is, let Syria get entrenched, and it will be like a stereo on Israel's doorstep. So the threading the needle for Israel is to make sure when it comes to humanitarian aid, Israel is there with tons and tons of humanitarian assistance. They're opening up a field hospital this week. And I think Israel wants to be right there when it comes to humanitarian assistance. But frankly, it has turned down certain requests from Ukraine for offensive weapons and defensive weapons like Iron Dome and things like that, because it is fearful that if they do that, Syria will close the skies. Remember, Syria dominates the skies. Russia dominates the skies of Syria since 2015. Every time Israel wants to hit one of these 2,000 targets, they need Russian permission. The fear is the Russians have not allowed the Syrians to turn on the same S-400s that the Turks have, and that will, every Israeli takeoff from Ben Gurion airport will be in the range of that S-400. So Israel is trying this balancing act. It wants to identify with the plight of the Ukrainians. This is a heroic moment of democracy, And at the same time, they don't want to risk that their citizens in Israel are suddenly vulnerable to Iranian missiles, and the Syrian skies have been shut off to them. So this is the balancing act that Israel is trying to do. And of course, the follow-on thing to the Bennett visit is the obvious, is, you know, that Israel would like to make sure that any Ukrainian Jews who want to come to Israel are able to do so. I think about 10,000 Ukrainian Jews have shown interest in Aliyah. I think it would have been higher, but the fact that the Ukrainian men are in the service, the women and their little children don't want to go too far. We've seen also about 3,500 Russian Jews, because the ruble, the Russian ruble, is like crashed. The Russian stock market, I think, has been closed. So I think there's going to be an uptick in both Ukrainian and Russian Jewish Aliyah, and Israel wants to be sure that it can do that. There have been a lot of Israelis also in Ukraine. Many have gotten out, some have not. But I think Israel is one of the most active countries in terms of trying to use its foreign ministry and the Jewish agency at the Polish border, at the Moldovan border, at the Hungarian border, the Romanian border, to try to extricate as many people as they can. I could say, being in Israel and having COVID, flipping all the Hebrew news channels, the sympathy of the Israeli public is incredible. We've seen the numbers are pretty remarkable in support of the Ukrainian people. There was a polling thing, which I think we list here, the Israel Democracy Institute, that 67% of Israelis believe, though, that the current level, the cautious stance, is well supported. So I think the government has support, you know, none of this is to derogate at all from the great admiration of Volodymyr Zelensky, who is Jewish. I think that the prime minister is Jewish, the defense minister is Jewish. It is a remarkable thing for those of people who follow Ukrainian nationalism to see how a Jewish person could get 70% support in running in the presidency, and has got wide support to this day. So, of course, I think you could argue that Putin's miscalculation, he has actually cemented, deepened, strengthened Ukrainian nationalism. Now, all this is going on at a time that another big development is happening, and that's the Iran talks. And here we keep hearing, I just heard today from someone else in the Israeli Defense Ministry, a very senior person, that they think there will be a deal next week, that it's basically done. This is, you know, the concept is to go back to 2015. Now and here I felt on the trips and some of the meetings I had with Dennis, some by myself, there was a real difference between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It was a tale of two cities, if you will. That the Tel Aviv visit was all the defense ministry people and the IDF people, and they see it as a done deal. They think there's nothing Israel could really do to stop this deal. And their view is it's all about putting together a deterrence package to upgrade Israel's offensive capabilities. So when this period ends, Israel will be ready to go if it needs to attack Iran. The Israeli defense officials say Israel is not ready. They need this deal as well as a bridge until Israel has reconfigured its defense budget. It just got an extra 4 billion shekels, over $1 billion in upgrades, but it's clear that the big upgrade would come from the US after an Iran deal. The fact that there's going to be congressional hearings is a time to get that upgrade. Is that more F-35s? Is that more KC-46? Refueling aircraft? Are there other things here? I think that package is going to be forthcoming. We'll need to see. So I think Tel Aviv, I felt, was focused on the package. How do you upgrade? How are you ready for the new reality? The Jerusalem, meaning the prime minister's office, the foreign ministry that are designed to deal with policy, they don't want to fight. They don't want to give up on the deal itself. They're trying to still quietly, under the radar, say, hey, Iran is only going to get 6 months of what they call breakout time. In other words, the original deal was if Iran goes from nuclear fuel that's reactor grade and to weapons grade, the world will have a year of advance notice. But when Trump left the deal in 2018 and Iran said, we're not bound by this, Trump's not bound, we're not bound, so we're going to zoom forward. So there's more advanced machines, what they call centrifuges. And at best, they're now 6 months away. So you can't erase the knowledge from people's heads. You can't erase the machines. You might destroy the machines, but you still have the designs of the machines. So they're going to be able, even if they go back and say, we're going to ship out all the uranium, except for the amount allowed in the deal, they could get to that breakout time of going from reactor grade fuel, what we call low enriched uranium, to LEU to HEU, high enriched uranium, which is weapons grade. They could do that in 6 months. And the Israelis are saying, hey, man, like, it's not fair that they get sanctions relief as if it's 2015, where they gave a year breakout, and instead they're only they're only giving 6 months at best, maybe less, and they want the full sanctions relief. And then there's some other like provisions there that are going to be very hard to swallow. Are the Iranian Revolutionary Guards going to be designated as terrorists or not, or is that going to be erased? So it's very going to be very tough, I think. But I think Tel Aviv versus Jerusalem here is Tel Aviv saying, look, whatever you get at the margins, you'll get at the margins, but you're not going to reverse the deal. We're going to focus on the package going forward. Israel is also more focused, I think, in 2025, under the terms of the deal, they could already deploy all the new centrifuges. So they'll be ready to go. And I think you could argue by 2030, there'll be almost zero breakout time. Also, the snapback, which was the UN provision that enables a country to say, hey, there's been a violation, I demand the reinstallation of sanctions. That might be going away with time. So Israel has got some arguments, but I think I haven't met anyone who thought Israel would prevail. I also didn't meet anyone who thought there would really be follow-on talks, what we call longer and stronger, that would deal with ballistic missiles, that will deal with greater anytime, any place inspections, things like that. I mean, if you're giving up these sanctions kind of on the front end, what incentive does Iran have to agree to follow on talks? So anyway, these are some of the challenges that I think are coming forward. I'll just say one more. I don't want to talk too long. So my last point is the Abraham Accords, and I think here it's going to bring it's a little bit going to bring me back also to the Ukraine issue. I think what's happened is that the Emirates and Israel keep growing closer, and the Houthi attacks on the UAE. And I know as people who are consumers of the Washington Institute, you guys have been following this issue. I was in the Emirates for 9 days in November, but by December, the Houthis had struck the UAE, and the UAE has felt that it has not gotten all the weaponry they thought they needed to ensure that that the UAE does not, that the Houthis are not able to hit again. They got some from the US, but they had to call in the Israelis, and the Israelis have given them a lot. I think that kind of being in the same foxhole together that the Israelis have been there with for them has helped the Emirati-Israeli relationship, which was incredibly strong beforehand. MBZ sees himself both as a military, the leader of the UAE, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, as both a military commander and as a statesman type. I know he's told people, my own mother, I feel like I couldn't defend her. Well, sirens are going off. Emirates are not used to having sirens going off. Israelis are, but the Emiratis are not. So I think that crisis is bringing the UAE and Israel closer. And I think the fact, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, but I think the fact that the Germans have tripled, is my understanding, their defense budget overnight from 50 billion euros to 150 billion euros to deal with the Ukraine crisis it is going to lead to closer German-Israeli relations on when it comes to missile defense, when it comes to dealing with Russian air defenses, which Israel has become an expert on now because Russia's in Syria. So I think that the fact that now that all these European countries are willing to spend more on defense, they do look to Israel to be a component of that as they bolster their defenses. I bring that only as an indication that sometimes things are, as I started this talk, not what they appear to be. And I think it's going to bring Israel closer to Germany and to some other European countries who are trying to upgrade their defense capabilities. So whether the crisis is in the Ukraine or whether the crisis is in Houthi or the Houthis, I think it's going to bring Israel closer to some of these in some of these relationships. Why don't I stop here? I didn't even get a chance to mention the Palestinians. I'm hoping some people will ask me other questions, but I don't want to talk too long. So I'd rather look forward to the discussion and fire away at me. Thank you very much for listening.
David, thank you. And you must have ESP because the first question is about the Palestinians. So the question comes from Steve Daniels. Does Israelis' encouragement of non-Jewish immigrants from Ukraine in any way bolster the Palestinian argument that more of them should also be allowed into Israel since they are non-Jewish as well?
Look, I don't think so. I think the Ukrainians that will come, first of all, I tend to think they are relatives of the Ukrainian Jews who are there, whether they are fully, there's all these conversion issues. I don't want to get into religious issues here, but I tend to think that it's not like a Ukrainian gets in a car like at the Polish border and just keeps going until he hits Israel. These are people that have pre-existing relationships. I don't think that there are going to be that many. I think the biggest influx is going to be of Ukrainian Jews and of Russian Jews. I don't think the Ukrainians coming are going to settle in the West Bank. This has always been much more of a nationalist struggle between Zionism, Palestinian nationalism, and I tend to think the Russians and Ukrainians that do settle in Ashkelon and Ashdod and more like Russian-speaking towns where there's Russian-speaking restaurants, there's Russian-speaking newspapers. I don't see the appetite for them to go to the West Bank. So I don't really think there's really a Palestinian angle here as I see it. You're on mute. Jeannie, I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Thank you. Just a reminder to submit your questions in the Q&A or in the chat. The next one is from Ron Scheinberg. What is happening with Israeli natural gas vis-a-vis Turkey?
Oh, it's interesting. I raised that question just an hour ago to somebody. Look, Israel was counting on a couple of things, which was this pipeline it was trying to do with Greece and Cyprus, but it's been ruled by the US, I think, is technically not feasible. Israel has been exporting more gas, I think, to Egypt. Egypt has got an LNG facility. I mean, Jay Bernstein's the big expert on oil. So I say, like, to be making that I say anything about oil in front of Jay Bernstein is like being in a seminar in heaven about boating and Noah is standing in the corner. So I defer to Jay to overrule, but I think the Israelis are able to provide more domestic consumption for Egypt, and Egypt is able to take the LNG and send it to Europe. There have been some talk of a pipeline, but I don't think that's feasible between Israel and Italy. It just seems to me way, way too expensive. Will the Turkish thing happen? Could that offset the 60% dependency that Europe has? Of course, Israel's natural gas is tiny compared to the Europeans' needs, but can I rule out, and again, I defer to Jay, but if you have thoughts, will the Turkish thing turn into something? I do notice that Bougie Herzog, who I was supposed to see in person with Dennis, but I had COVID, so I did it on Zoom with him last Friday or 2 Fridays ago, said that he went to Cyprus and Greece before his trip to Ankara today, because it's very important that Israel maintains those sets of relationships. The problem I find is with Erdogan is that he's so capricious. You just don't know with him. I think his agenda is an American agenda because of he got shut out of the F-35s because of the S-400s that he did with Russia. And therefore, he's trying to find a way into America's good graces. And he sees that he hopes that the road to Washington goes through Jerusalem. He will not be the first to think that. Whether that works for him, I don't know. I'd like to see what he does with Hamas. I'd like to see what he does on funding some Muslim Brotherhood questions. We'll have to see. I think with Erdogan, I must say, and people know me, know I always try to be diplomatic, but I admit I don't trust the guy. And I just think he will turn on a dime. And now he wants to be Israel's friend, but in 6 months from now, if he needs to rally his base of his AKP party in Turkey, he looks at Israel as the boogeyman. And so can you really build an oil, a gas pipeline with him are my questions. I don't know, Jay, do you have any thoughts on this? Jay, you're muted, I think. Jay, I think
I don't know that I can add much other than that. If you want to solve for Europe's dependence on Russian natural gas for imports, the only shorter term, building a pipeline to Europe is a long term. It's a lot of money and it's long term. Whereas if there's excess liquefaction capability at the Egyptian facility, which I believe there is, if you can get it there and export it on LNG ships, that'll help right away. But I don't know that the volume is material. And against Europe's dependence on Russian gas is in the order of magnitude 30 to 35%.
Right, of course. Okay, Jeannie, next question.
Thank you both. And Lynn actually has a question. So moderator's prerogative.
I have a couple of questions,
Go for it,
actually.
Lynn.
Okay, two. One is, what is Israel's perspective about the potential of delisting IRGC as a terrorist organization? And the second one is, how is Israel, I've seen the recent video of Israel shooting down an Iranian drone that happened a while ago, I guess, but they just released the video. And I was just wondering what is Israel doing to combat the Iranian drone capabilities?
That's good questions. So the first one was, what was the
IRGC.
The IRGC. Look, clearly Israel's against that, and that I think is an example of what I said, that I think Jerusalem and Tel Aviv are not, they're all synced up and laced up, where the defense establishment is like a laser beam focused on, okay, what is going to be the package for Israel, that assuming this deal goes through. And I think the Bennett-Lapid duo are trying to say, hey, to focus on the deal itself. Like I said, the asymmetry between the 6 months of breakout but getting a full year's sanctions relief. And I know Lapid has, I think, raised, I think I saw at the president's conference when they were over there, the whole IRGC issue, that it's clear they've been involved in a lot of assassinations. Just because this happened on Trump's watch doesn't mean it's not true, and therefore they would like to see that. These are examples, I think, of trying to fight this issue at the margins in a certain way, saying, okay, we're not going to be able to reverse this deal, but there's some particularly objectionable dimensions associated with it, and this is one of them that you pointed out, Lynn. So I don't know what the result is. Look, this is becoming also a political thing in Israel, where Bibi Netanyahu is saying, in the opposition. Now, whenever you're in the opposition, it's like you're in the bleachers. Everyone knows I like sports analogies. So you're in the bleachers, you say whatever you want. So you're in the bleachers and you say, hey, Bennett, you're Mr. Nice Guy, but what have you gotten for being Mr. Nice Guy with this administration? I went to Congress, I took the heat. Yeah, it was very expensive. I lost a lot of the Democrats, but I gave people the unvarnished Israeli view. Bennett and Lapid don't want to go that way. Their view was that was too costly politically, that Israel needs bipartisan support. Even 80% of the Jewish community votes Democratic. So I think their view is we're going to say tough things inside the room, but not outside the room. And we'll see if that works. I would just urge people, not to assume that the game is over in a certain way, and that even if there's a breakthrough in Vienna, there's going to have to be congressional hearings on this. I don't know if there'll be a vote, and I think the administration could get its way on the vote. But I think the fact that, I'm told that about close to 50 Republican senators this morning met with a representative of the Israeli Defense Ministry, largely on Iran. People are going to want to know on both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republican, okay, what is the package for Israel? How do we know that Israel is more secure and not more vulnerable as a result of this? Because it's a short package. At best, it's from 2022 to 2030, but maybe it's much shorter. But so how is Israel being taken care of? So I think it isn't over yet. But Bibi is like basically saying like you're down by 3 touchdowns and it's starting the fourth quarter. That doesn't mean it's over. And so I think that Israel's going to focus on like Tel Aviv wants, which is an upgraded package. How it plays out in Congress, we need to see. But I think Bennett and Lapid don't want to give up the fighting it at the margins, like at the IRGC, some other dimensions of the deal. The question of, do you close the files on some of existing issues with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency? On the issue of the drones, look, this is a big deal for Israel. Israel, any Iranian drone that gets through Israel is a failure. There's no other way around it. This is why there's a Iron Dome. This is why there's David Sling. They're now coming up with this thing. I don't know. Bennett thinks it'll be done in a year. The defense ministry people tell me, David's going to take a little longer. That Israel is creating this laser kind of 360 where you can shoot down anything and at a very low cost. Because part of the problem is that some of these countries have like these cheaper missiles that are lethal, and Israel has to waste the whole Iron Dome on this, and that are more expensive. So how do you defend yourself in a cheaper way too? So I think that the laser defense is part of it. The arrow, the David Sling, and Iron Dome, the arrow. There's multi layers, but there's no doubt that any drone that gets through is a failure. And what lessons do you learn from it? I think is for Israel is the key thing. But this is like for them, this is money time. This is what counts, is any Iranian thing that could get through their defenses that they have to make sure doesn't happen again.
Thank you, David. It's great the Israelis, on top of everything they're dealing with, are cost efficient too.
Yeah.
There are several questions in the queue now, and there's lots of interest about the MBZ, MBS, the famous call that didn't happen. What's really going on?
Look, that Wall Street Journal article, Jonah's my assistant, and I was like, as soon as I saw that Wall Street Journal thing, I was like, what the heck is this? And I was totally energized by it. I think the Wall Street Journal piece it looks like was a little overstated when it comes to MBZ, at least. I don't know about the Saudi part. I think the Emirati oil minister this afternoon just announced that they're going to increase production. For those of you who didn't read this Wall Street Journal article, it basically said that both MBS and MBZ basically have kind of shunned Biden's call to increase oil and gas production to offset, European vulnerability and American vulnerability. Although Russia, again, Jay knows better than me, but my understanding is it's a pretty small percentage of America's gas and oil imports. But clearly, if you want Europe to do more, they're going to want to know, well, where are we going to get the offsets here? So clearly, you want to go to the Gulf. but each one has a reason to be upset with America. That's I was trying to say in my remarks about MBZ. I think he felt on the Houthis, he didn't get enough. And from someone, I talked to someone today who sat with MBZ personally during this crisis, he felt the US didn't provide enough. And the fact that it couldn't stop these attacks, that that MBZ's own mother called and said, why are sirens going off in Abu Dhabi? Even these little psychological things, don't discount them on leaders. And MBZ is a military commander. He also went to Sandhurst in England, like the West Point. And I think for him, it's a matter of pride. You protect your people. So he felt that the US turned him down on some weapon systems. And I think that really got him angry, and he felt bitter. And then he turned to the Israelis, and the Israelis, from my understanding, have come through for him on a lot of things. Now, at the same time, he doesn't want an open rift with the United States. And that's why that Wall Street Journal thing was kind of so startling to me last night, because I was like, oh, that doesn't sound like NBZ, because that is like thumbing your nose. I mean, there was talk of Biden even making a trip to the Gulf. And that would mean seeing MBS. You can't go to Saudi Arabia and not see MBS. I mean, and everyone on this call knows the rift with over the Khashoggi affair and MBS. There's an article in the Atlantic, which that he's kind of saying, America, you deal with America, I'll deal with Saudi Arabia. And we're hearing reports. I don't know this, and I want to be very careful. I don't want people to come up and quote me on this, but we're hearing stories that that MBS is just saying, look, there's really no hope here with America, and I'm going to just wait out the Democrats until the Republicans come back. So that would be really getting involved in American politics that way. I don't know. I saw some quotes that were attributed to the White House spokeswoman, Jen Psaki, that kind of really didn't seem right to me, that I couldn't really, it almost suggested that Biden had tried with the Saudis and failed, and now was going to revert to a more confrontationalist posture. I hope that that's wrong. We could probably find out if Jen Psaki said what was reported that she said yesterday about Saudi Arabia being a pariah state. I mean, it's things that Biden said on the campaign trail, but he hasn't said it since. And you only say something like that now if you've just completely given up. So I don't know. I think the Wall Street Journal piece was wrong when it came to MBZ. I think it was right that there was the bitterness over the Houthis, but that it didn't lead to them thumbing their nose at Biden. But on MBS, it could be it's more accurate. So that the piece might be 50% right or 60% right or something like that. But it's worrisome, because on the Ukraine, you want to be sure that we're all kind of pulling in the oars in the same direction. And this is the ultimate case of where you need help. And if MBS's approach is saying, well, you're not there for me, you're not willing to kind of renormalize me, well, I'm not going to be there for you when you need this emergency. I think that's a real sad state of affairs. It also has an implication for the Abraham Accords. If the US was trying to see what could be done as kind of, confidence building, not yet normal ties, but just what would be a roadmap to look towards, you can't do it if those relations are poisonous. So I hope in the next 24 hours, the Saudi piece will be clarified. I'm glad to see that the Emirati story was not accurate, but between not accurate and completely untrue, there might be a distance. So I'm not here to say that everything's great with the Emiratis and the US. Like I said, there is that bitterness.
Thank you. I think that it's time that Dennis and you lead a strategic dialogue off the record to get all of these important players on the same page, because if you could bring them together.
It's funny it came up because we haven't talked about the Palestinians. So I spent 9 hours at Jeannie in Ramallah, and I sat with 3 hours alone, just me and Hussein Sheikh, who's the right-hand man of Abbas. And I sat with Jibril Rajoub, who's considered the other big contender in the post Abu Mazen world. There's a group of Hussein Sheikh and Majid Faraj on the very pro-Abbas camp and very hostile to Hamas, and Jabril who's saying, well, maybe we got to open up more with Hamas in a post-Abu Mazen world. And I could talk about that because I have an analytical takeaway on that. But what was really striking, Jeannie, was I said, and I think I might have said to Jonah on the way out, I said, there's got to be a way to do an Emirati-Palestinian
There
reconciliation,
you go.
because unless they reconcile, the Emiratis are not going to give money to the Palestinians. They're still bitter over, MBZ being burned in effigy at the time of the Abraham Accords. Will Abbas apologize to him? He didn't do it, but his people did it, and he set a very negative tone. I don't know, but I realize that some of these relationships are screwed up, and unless the relationships are fixed, and ironically, it's not about Israel. I mean, it affects Israel, but it's not because of Israel, unless they're addressed. I will say one word on the Hamas issue, just because some people might ask. It's clear to me when it comes to succession, there's really two camps. There's the Abbas camp with Majid and Hussein, who feel very comfortable, frankly, in dealing with the Israeli defense community at this point. And I could tell you in 3 hours of discussion, I was struck how good of a read they had of Israel. I had not seen such a good Palestinian read of Israel in all my years, I would say. Then I see the other camp of Jabril and Salam Fayyad, who was a friend of mine who I liked. Salam and Jabril I've known for 30 years, and but I think their view is if you don't try to patch it up with Hamas, a PA is not going to have the legitimacy to kind of rise up, and they might just kind of go in a downward trajectory. And the problem is that there've been so many efforts to reconcile that have failed. And what the camp of Hussein Sheikh and Majid are saying is, if Hamas wants to reconcile with us, that's fine. We're not, gonna, but they have to pay. Now, their view of paying, when you say, what do you mean they have to pay? What they mean by paying is that they have to sign all the agreements with Israel. They cannot have a free lunch and think, oh, we can reconcile and ignore the elephant in the room, which is, do you accept the Israelis or you don't? And the PA's view is, we paid that price with our publics to say that's the way forward. And Hamas has never paid that price. So, camp number, let's call it camp number one of Majid and Hussein, their view is, if Hamas wants in, they have to pay the entrance fee. You can't win a lottery unless you buy a ticket. And the other school is, the PA is weaker unless it finds a common language with Hamas. And I don't know which school will prevail. I do know the Israeli Defense Establishment is definitely closer to that first camp than to the second camp, even though they might have a high personal respect for Salam Fayyad. And Dennis and I had a really interesting discussion over there. We tend to agree on 98% of the issues, but I just said Israel is going to be hostile on this one, because I think they're going to say Salam Fayyad lives in New Jersey, in Princeton, New Jersey, and he doesn't have the texture of the ground, and also the Israelis are used to dealing with that first camp, and they clearly like the outlook of that first camp. So I think for me, what's changed with this visit, and this is the first time I'm articulating it, I haven't even gone even to a staff meeting yet. So Jeannie, you're hearing it before Rob and others, is I think what's changed is, while I still think Israel wants to be low profile, it sees no percentage for giving any side a bear hug, oh, Israel likes this camp, because that'll just put like the mark of Cain on the people you want to help, you'll end up hurting. So, I mean, I think they'll be the same. They're not going to say anything. But privately, they clearly have a dog in this fight. They clearly like the people more that share a common view of Hamas. And anyway, that to me was an interesting takeaway of the visit.
That is definitely, and that's an important difference. Harriet Schleifer has a few questions.
Go for it. Hi, Harriet.
And Harriet, I'm surprised you have time to even come up with questions with what's going on. What stymied the Greece, Cyprus, Israel gas deal? And regarding the Iran deal, does Congress have to vote to support it if it comes to that?
A good question. Look, I admit, I don't know the details where the US came with the view that it was just not feasible. It was a very long kind of route. I don't know the under the water kind of. I'm not a pipeline guy, over land, under the sea, but I think the administration felt it was just not technically feasible. But it's a shame because this has been part of the regional, kind of groupings of Israel, Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, maybe even the Palestinians off the coast of Gaza, if there's a certain concession there that Israel is willing to give. That group has had strategic implications. I mean, the EU, and Harriet, I know with your work with the AJC and others in Europe, I mean, you know this, that Europe was more of a monolith in the old days on Israel, and it's no longer a monolith. And partly it's the Eastern European countries that have had a different view, but it's also been the southeast people of Greece and Cyprus that have come so close to Israel over gas. So I want to know, what are the implications of this for this group staying together? Because it's been a wonderful thing. I mean, Greece used to be one of the most anti-Israel, anti-American countries around in Europe. And it seems like them and the prime minister and the energy ministers, they're like meeting, it seems like every other month for some gas summit. So I want to know, what are the implications here? It's still new to me, but you're asking a great question. I wish I had an answer as good as the question. On what was the second point?
The second one is, does Congress have to vote on the
I
Iran?
don't know. Look, I think with a 50-50 Senate, I tend to think, anyway, the president could veto, even if it wasn't 50-50, he could veto something if there was a vote. Remember, if you go back to 2015, the victory of the Obama administration was that this would not be considered a treaty. If it was a treaty, it needed 2/3. If it's not a treaty, it's an executive agreement, for better or for worse. So for better meant Obama didn't need 2/3. As a matter of fact, he had 59 senators against Obama in 2015, but he didn't care because he didn't need 2/3 for a treaty. Now, what was negative for him is that once it's an executive agreement and not a treaty, the next administration can nullify it, which is what Trump did. He said, I'm leaving the deal. That was it. So it's a weaker kind of, platform to stand on, but it's, he won't get overridden by Congress. So, but I do think there'll be hearings. And I think even people, I wonder, like Menendez, who's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who's a Democrat, who was against. You had people like the senator and there are a few others. Schumer is now the Senate Majority Leader. There were some key senators who happen to be Jewish who voted against. And I find it hard to believe there won't be hearings. And in the hearings, these issues will come out. Well, what are you doing? What's the package for Israel and all this? So I think the president doesn't have to worry about a vote, but I think the hearings in an election year, I mean, there's a midterm year, I think this could be powerful. And I'm just saying, the fact that there's an announcement in Vienna next week is not the final word, because I do think there will be hearings and these issues will be discussed, but I don't think the president will be overridden.
Thank you. And we have one more question, and this is from David Pulver. We see how Russia is using their nuclear capability to impact the West options in Ukraine. Allowing Iran to have this capability seems like a disaster. How can we allow Iran to get this capability?
Well, this is the big question. I mean, I'm not here to, the others here at the Institute who were Mike Singh and Patrick and Dennis have focused more on that angle. I clearly am not supportive of Iran getting a nuclear weapon. This is done to prevent them from getting a weapon until 2030. But, I think they're fair questions. What is it going to be beyond 2030? I also think the real story that we don't talk about that much is I don't think Israel is ready for a strike. And in a certain way, I think Israel is looking for a bridge until it can upgrade its capabilities. So is that 2 years or is that in 7 years? I don't know. I've heard differing estimates when I'm over there, but I think that Israel feels that it's not ready. Now, this could all be disinformation, and it's an incredible orchestrated work, but that Israel wants some sort of a bridge where at least that Iran by expelling all of its uranium out of the country, its nuclear fuel out, except what would be permitted under 2015, a few hundred grams. I think this is where the defense establishment in Israel is. We don't like this deal, but better a bad deal than no deal. But clearly, it would be better to have a good deal. And but that gets to the longer and stronger question, which it was supposed to be follow-on negotiations that President and Secretary of State Blinken talked about on the campaign trail. But if Iran gets the sanctions relief front-loaded, what interest does Iran have to agree in a follow-on set of negotiations? And that's why I'm pretty skeptical that there will be a follow-on deal at this time. So I think that the questioner asked a good question. I was just trying to put forward what I think are some of the calculations. You kick the can down the road for several years, but you're deferring a problem, you're not solving it. What I don't know is with the Ukraine issue, to what extent does Iran now going to get in here? Jay also would be the better person than me, but to what extent does Iran pick up the slack that it's going to be able to sell more oil, and by selling more oil, it's going to be able to use the revenues in certain ways. There's clearly, we're coming out with a piece, I don't know if it's out today or tomorrow, I saw it on what extra revenues would Iran get? There's frozen assets in South Korea and all these places. Is it $12 billion? But the question is where does the money go? And I don't know if people mention Iran and Venezuela as examples of countries where, okay, we don't use Russian oil, we're banning Russian oil. By the way, the Europeans are not, because they can't afford to. The British say they will by the end of the year. We'll see if that happens. The US amount, I think, again, I defer to Jay, but I think is relatively small at around 600,000 barrels a day. It's a relatively small amount, but does Iran and Venezuela pick up the slack, and does it give it more her hard currency? So is this Ukraine crisis helpful to Iran? It seems like it might be.
In the meantime, Lynn has another question, and then we have one more.
Yeah, I'm easy. Whatever's good for you guys.
We're approaching the top of the hour, so those are going to be the last two questions.
Okay,
go ahead.
So my question is, when we heard from Anthony Blinken during the campaign, and they were talking about the longer and stronger deal, and they criticized a little bit the Obama administration for being so desperate for a deal that they would do anything for the deal. And I feel like now the Biden administration has fallen into that same trap. Why are they so desperate? Why can't they play hardball? Why are we so bad at negotiating, I guess, is the question that I have.
Yeah, it's a very good question. All right, I would say on that one, look, I don't want to be the guy who's the defense attorney here for the administration. I do think when they are enriching at 60% capacity, and of course, this gets into the Washington game of politics. Well, if Trump wouldn't have left the deal, then Iran wouldn't have left the deal, and then they wouldn't be like, sprinting to the finish. So if we could like keep them in their box, so they're not at 60%, but they're back at 3.75, that'll hopefully tide us over till 2030. But if we do nothing, they'll keep enriching at, weapons grade, which is clearly 90%. So I think they use, they point to that, and they also point to the Israeli defense establishment, frankly, that says it's not ready. And those two things, I think, have contributed to it. It's also clear for this administration that they don't see the Middle East as a top tier issue. I think they are what I call the 3 C's, now maybe 3 C's and 1 U, which is COVID, China, climate, and now maybe Ukraine. So you get the feeling like they keep saying we want to put it in the box, like they want to park this issue. And the defense establishment in Israel is not really disagreeing with them greatly, because they kind of, I think, see it as a fait accompli, and they're trying to think, what do they get out of it? Now, to say what they get out of it sounds a little cynical, which I think is unfair. It's more that Israel feels that Iran is going to get this by the end of the decade, and Israel has got to be prepared that it could defend its citizens, and if need be, have to do an attack. So I think I could say, we're on a recorded line. I can't name names here, but if I said the name, you'd say, wow, I heard that name. That's a pretty senior name. But someone said, is it a bad deal? It's a bad deal, but it's better than no deal for us in Israel. And that was pretty striking. If I said the name, a household name, you would say, okay, if that's the way they think, okay. But I admit, I share Lynn's frustration, because this isn't the longer and stronger deal. Or you had one more question?
Yes, thank you. Last question from Ron Scheinberg. At your meetings with the Palestinians, did the case before the International Criminal Court come up?
Yeah, it did. I said, look, here's the paradox of this whole craziness, which is that you like Defense Minister Gantz. You say Gantz's word is his bond. You trust Gantz. I've never heard such positive expressions about the Israelis than I heard on this trip. That the Palestinians have lowered their expectations. They don't think any grand deal is anywhere near in the offing. They want to do smaller things. Can there be things at the Allenby Bridge? Can there be things on 4G and on Wi-Fi? I don't think there's a whole bunch of things. And Dennis and I both think there should be infrastructure projects that are part of state building, but yet don't have security implications for Israel. And in some ways, I felt more in sync than ever. Like I said, I felt their read of the Israeli political system and the defense establishment was very good. And yet I had to throw it in there. I said, hey guys, on one hand, it seems like a honeymoon going on with Israel, but you're going forward at the ICC. And that just seems such a contradiction to me. Then I went the next day, and when Jonah was with me, and we met with the UN envoy. And because the Israelis said, like, you always want to know what we could do for you, but you never talk about what you could do for us in terms of stopping things at the ICC. And the UN envoy thinks things have got to a point where the Palestinians are not a key player. There's a kind of a bureaucratic momentum at this point to move forward. But it's an incredible turn of events, Jeannie and Lynn and Jay and everyone, that there are these two trends that are going on simultaneously. One is normalization and one is criminalization. And the normalization is happening with Arab states. And Israel is more welcome in the region as even a potential ally against some of the trends dealing with Iran or with the US retrenchment from the Middle East. And yet in The Hague in Europe, you get this ICC case. And you kind of think these two ideas should not be coexisting in parallel, and yet they are. And so it's very frustrating. Could the Palestinians turn it off, or has it gone too far, or are there things? I don't want to get too mystical here, too mysterious, but there is a diplomatic initiative that we at the Washington Institute are working on that I think could have an impact here. I don't want to talk about it now, but I do think if this works, Jay Bernstein will look at this and say this is one of the greatest initiatives of the Institute. So let's see if it happens, but we're trying it out, and I think it could have an implication for the ICC as well. So we'll see. We'll see.
David, thank you. As always, you don't just give us a briefing on one topic. There's like 8 or 10 that you're covering at the same time. And it's a good thing you have 10 fingers because you have fingers in so many different projects. And that's a good opportunity for me to promote your podcasts. So for those of you who have not listened to David's podcast series, please do it. Even if you're walking, working out, relaxing at home, they're very informative, and I'll add entertaining. So thank you, David.
And can I also throw in my usual thank you to the trustees, because I always say we get to do what we do because you do what you do. And so we're very grateful to all of you. We know that you can direct your resources in a myriad of directions, and the fact that you choose us, we're only as strong as you guys are. So we're just grateful to you. I hope some of you, whoever can, will join Dennis and me this summer on a trip to Israel and the West Bank. I think it's going to be great. After COVID, I know a lot of people want to get out. And I was just very heartened by all the yeses we've gotten. That people said, yeah, of course we'll see you guys. Bring whoever you want. So that was great.
Absolutely. And for those of you, whether you're going on the trip or you're not going, we also have the Weinberg Founders Conference in Washington, May 4th through 6th. So if you can't find one of the 5 emails from Rob Satloff that have come in the past 3 weeks, just give me a call or text me, and I'll be happy to get the information to you. To Lynn Levy-Pasekis, not only our vice president, but a member of the family, of which that David and Dennis and Rafe Alamari are in the program, which is the Irwin Levy Family Program on the U.S.-Israel Strategic Relationship. Thank you very much. And Jay, we are always thrilled to have our wonderful president join us. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.